Hello, good afternoon, and welcome to the Eisenhower Presidential Library. Thank you for joining us for our Lunch and Learn. We do want to apologize for starting a little bit late. We have had a few technical difficulties, but we are ready to go. So thank you for hanging out with us and sticking around. I'm pleased to welcome Dr. Jeremy Black, who is going to talk to us about Eisenhower, the Cold War, and the American role. Take it away, Dr. Black.
Thank you very much. And may I say hello, and may I say how excellent I think it is that you have a program of public engagement of this type. All too often we tend to think of a gap between the wider public interest in history and the way in which too many institutions and historians fail to meet that. And I think it's really important in a vibrant democracy like the United States to see the presidential libraries taking this role. Now, in a sense, our topic has been made even more pertinent because of the nature of the international crisis at the moment. I mean, specifically about Ukraine, but also the more general sense of volatility in the world and the possibility that the world's leading power, which is the United States, is going to have to consider its position on a number of international challenges. And that represents a way to look at Eisenhower, because the Eisenhower administrations, the period of his presidency from 1953 to 1961, was a period in which the United States was itself facing enormous volatility. Now, ironically, from the perspective of the 1960s and the belief that, as it were, the 1960s started the world anew in all sorts of respects, the 1950s was made to appear, and not just in the United States, but more generally, the 1950s was made to appear staid, conventional, conservative, and, as it were, therefore redundant, with very little to show and to teach the generations that came afterwards. I think now we can see things slightly differently. And from the perspective of the Cold War, which is what I want to be talking about, it is, of course, pertinent that commentators have looked at the last few years, particularly since Russian intervention in Crimea in 2014. They've looked at it and used the vocabulary of a new Cold War, which therefore raises the question about the Western response to the early stages of the last one, not least because while history is not linear, it never repeats itself exactly, it is nevertheless the case that the easiest way for a data set for the present, because we don't have a data set for the future, it hasn't happened yet, is to look past. So, what was the challenge facing the United States when Eisenhower was elected in 1952 and became president soon after in 1953? Well, first, the Cold War had, as it were, begun with the Bolshevik Revolution. I use the term Bolshevik because not all communists were Bolsheviks. The Bolshevik Revolution in 1917. And indeed, in terms of American relations with the Soviet Union, that war was, as it were, hot in its earlier stages when the United States was one of 14 countries which intervened militarily in the Russian Civil War. And unsuccessfully so. Or I say unsuccessfully, of course, unsuccessfully so in terms of the failure to stop the Bolsheviks taking over, and in terms of the inability to stop the Bolsheviks seizing what might well have been and were for a while proto-independent polities, including incidentally Ukraine, but also Armenia, Azerbaijan, Georgia, more successfully so, on the other hand, in the case of keeping Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Finland, and Poland out of the Soviet grasp. But for the United States, in the 1920s and 30s, the period of Eisenhower's, as it were, early stages of his military career, the prospect of conflict with the Soviet Union was not to the fore. It was not something that American strategists really had to envisage, and it's not something that American army officers had to consider. not something for American strategists. If you think about the so-called color-coded American military planning, Plan Orange, Plan Green, and so on, in the 1920s and 1930s, there were color codes, most particularly for war with Japan. There were also other ones, of course, including for war with Britain, incidentally, war with Brazil, Plan White, which was for dealing with the potential insurrection within the United States in terms of what was seen as the threat of communist-backed labor movements. But in essence, there was no assumption that American troops would again be sent into the Soviet Union, as they had done as part of this coalition during the Russian Civil War. And indeed, in terms of the major military commitments in the United States in the 1930s, the two main branches of the military that had to consider active out of theatre operations were the Marines, the alternative army in the Caribbean and Central America, in Nicaragua, the Dominican Republic, and Haiti, and the Navy in terms of the possibility of conflict with Japan. This changed dramatically with World War II, and World War II entailed a recurrence of the commitment of a significant army, plus in this case a large air force support, but yet again the Navy, to the European theatre. At the end of the war, with American troops on and slightly beyond the Elbe, American troops into what we would now call the Czech Republic, Bohemia, there was an understanding that there would be a continuing American presence, in the sense that there was going to be an American occupation of a portion of Germany and a portion of Austria. But there was no assumption at that point that it would be necessarily the case that there would be an abrupt conflict with the Soviet Union. And there were both political and military reasons for this. Political reasons for this in the sense that the Roosevelt administration, which of course continued to just before the end of the war, and its successor, the Truman administration, but particularly Roosevelt believed that he had or could have some sort of working relationship with Stalin. He saw Churchill as an anachronistic anti-communist. He thought that it ought to be possible to have a stable situation. And the use of the atomic bomb, which the United States had a monopoly of, and which brought a rapid close to the war with Japan, and that at a time when the Japanese were still in occupation of the Japanese home islands, with the exception of Okinawa and Iwo Jima. They were still in occupation of places like Java, Malaya, Singapore, much of China, including Canton, Shanghai, Nanjing. At that, it was a dramatic demonstration of the geopolitical and strategic possibilities stemming from a nuclear capability, a capability both in terms of the atom bombs and in terms of the strike capability offered by bombing in order to take this forward. And America had the largest long-range bomber force in the world. So from that perspective, it appeared possible in 1945, 1946, to push through a process of demobilization. And indeed, the American army after World War II demobilized very rapidly, as indeed had happened after World War I, and as had happened after the Civil War. It was a characteristic of America as a military power that it moved from being a wartime military power to a peacetime military power with great abruptness. And this was seen as part of a kind of democratic contract with the citizen soldier, and was contrasted implicitly or explicitly with the situation in authoritarian states. Now, that political and military optimism, and it's an optimism that it's easy to forget about, but that optimism was first corroded, then eroded, and then disintegrated in a period which different observers for different moments, but from 1945 onwards. We can use terms like the failure of deterrence, the failure of appeasement. We can use whatever vocabulary we like, but it was becoming increasingly clear that the Soviet Union was not going to accept a settlement of European interests, the German question, in terms that kept relations, as it were, comfortable. Khrushchev's quip made it later, of course, when it was safe to make it, that Stalin's idea of foreign policy was keeping the anti-aircraft batteries manned round Moscow, prepared for immediate attack on Moscow, that is, was a quip that captured an intense paranoia on the part of the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union, as a militarized society, did not need to demobilize. In fact, you could argue it wouldn't have been able effectively to demobilize. And that paranoia was transferred with a degree of reason to first concern, then anxiety, and then indeed, when the Soviet Union acquired nuclear capability, a degree of paranoia, or certainly panic, on the part of Western powers, including the United States. Because whereas initially, when there had been concern about the possibility of a war with the Soviets, the assumption had been that this, as far as the United States was concerned, would be essentially a conflict in Europe. American troops involved, American aircraft involved, but essentially in Europe. Once the Soviets had the atomic weaponry, and once it was assumed that they could put them in their big four-engine bombers, and indeed possibly just send the bombers on one-way missions, which would extend their cruising range, then actually the United States, the mainland United States, came within target. This was an uneasy background, and the uneasy background had escalated by the extent to which, instead of there being a clear limitation to the Chinese communism, the Chinese communists had moved from controlling mainland China. They'd moved on to their first amphibious operation of any scale, the seizure of the island of Hainan. They'd obviously moved to take Tibet, and they'd moved into the Korean Peninsula in order to, as it were, in their eyes, rectify the failure of North Korea. And in doing so, the alliance with the Soviet Union had been consolidated. And that, of course, was a fundamental strategic challenge for the United States. The United States was facing, first, a position in which it was a frontline power against communism, as it had not been in the 20s and 30s, in the earlier Cold War. And secondly, it was facing the situation that it was now opposed to both the Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China. And in doing so, was in a vulnerable position, or apparently vulnerable position, or at least a difficult position. As you will think about it in terms of American geopolitics, in essence, the peak periods of anxiety have been the periods when the Soviet Union and China have been aligned, the period from the Korean War to the latter stages of the Vietnam War. There was then a benign period from the American perspective, the Western perspective, a balanced period, if you like, from the last stages of the Vietnam War till roughly the early 2000s. And then in the early 2000s, Russia exploited growing Chinese concern about the United States. China exploited growing Russian concern about the United States. And we're in the situation we're in at the moment, in which there is a danger, the challenge from Russia and the challenge from China are each made more threatening, more challenging, to use the term of our days, precisely because of the fact that those two powers are together. So that was not an easy or benign background for American foreign policy, and nor was it a benign background for the public discussion of foreign policy, because the public had been obviously used, been made use in 1944, 1945 to the idea of triumph. Indeed, World War II is somewhat different to World War I in terms of its, as it were, inner pattern. In World War I, there was no sign that Germany would necessarily lose till the summer of 1918. Indeed, in the spring of 1918, period when America has gone into the war, of course, and American troops are being rushed across the Atlantic, in the spring of 1918, the Germans launched a series of offensives on the Western Front, and and they've also knocked Russia out of the war, and they're fighting a one-front war and are a threat. In the Second World War, although the Germans go on having to encounter a two-front war to the end, that is part and parcel of a situation in which there appears to be, both in the war with Germany and in the war with Japan, which is not fighting the Soviet Union until the very end of the war, there appears to be a very different timetable, in the sense that from the American perspective, it's a timetable of Axis success up to the late summer of 1942, in the case of Germany against the Soviet Union, on the Eastern Front against the British in North Africa, in the case of the Japanese advances into the Solomon Islands. But then, combination of Midway, Guadalcanal, in particularly the fight back in Guadalcanal, which in the Pacific and in Europe, Stalingrad, El Alamein, and then the Americans landing in the Torch operation. It gives you a sense that from late 42 onwards, and this was very beneficial for Roosevelt in the midterms, from late 42 onwards, it's actually the war is going in one direction. Now, of course, there were still serious problems. Leyte Gulf, for example, in the war against Japan, German abilities to make counterattacks in Europe, and indeed the German use of new technology in the later stages of the war, rockets, new types of submarines. But nevertheless, the trend was a clear one. And that was helped by the way in which you've got successive film of American troops moving into European cities and Asian positions, and it's all going in one direction. I think it's fair to say that the public was not prepared for the scenario that occurs from the late 40s. Failure in China, serious difficulties in Korea, and very heavy casualties without victory. The consolidation of the Soviet position in Eastern Europe, a sense of menace. And it's against that background that the 52 election is fought, and it's against that background that Eisenhower comes to power. Now, there are different ways of looking at Eisenhower's foreign policy and his geopolitics, but I suppose what one could fairly say from the perspective of today is that Eisenhower was a consolidator who was aware of the risk scenario of the situation and was anxious to avoid provoking a major conflict. He famously remarked to Malenkov at the Geneva conference in 55 that the two of them, Malenkov was then head of the Soviet government, that the two of them had the capacity to end human life in the northern hemisphere and to lessen it in the southern. And of course, by that stage, the atomic bomb, and remember, the atomic bomb is not as it were, a fixed state. Their atomic bombs become significantly more lethal, but not only had atomic bombs become more lethal, but also there was the new addition of the hydrogen bomb, and there were the developments in delivery systems, both in terms of long-range planes and the initiatives in missiles that were to develop into good ground-to-ground missile systems, and also developments which people were unclear about what they would mean, but in sea-based missile systems for atomic weapons, both for aircraft off carriers, but also from submarines. So there was no doubt at all that the world was becoming much more dangerous. it was also becoming much more unpredictable. And in that circumstance, I think it's fair to say that Eisenhower's position was one that was, in a way, feeling his way forward in from a perspective, obviously, that was hostile towards the totalitarian nature and implications of communism, but feeling his way forward in order to try and consolidate the non-communist bloc, but without risking war. So in part, this represented the development of regional alliances, particularly Cento and Cito in Asia, the development and trying to strengthen NATO in Europe, Western Europe, particularly bringing in the Bundeswehr, creating the new West German army, which the French were initially quite reluctant about. And at the time that the Bundeswehr was created, it was the largest NATO army in Europe, situated in Europe. The French were taking part in anti-insurrectionary struggles. The Algeria struggle was just about to kick off. The Vietnam one, first Vietnam one, had come to a close in 1954. The British, of course, were engaged in their own colonial anti-insurgency campaigns in places like Malaya, Kenya. Indeed, as late as I think it's 1964, there were more British troops east of Suez than west of Suez. And that necessarily lessened the British and French contingents on the inter-German border in West Germany. And there was a limit to how many American troops the American government felt able to locate there. It had a large number, but it was a limit to how many that they felt that they could locate. So an absolutely crucial aspect of American foreign policy was the development of the Bundeswehr, the arming of the Bundeswehr at a relatively sophisticated level, and its integration into NATO planning systems and command structures. And Eisenhower was good at that. He, of course, had a lot of experience with NATO. He also, of course, and the American government was to follow a pattern, did not want West Germany, nor for that matter Japan, which also had interests in this area, once integrated into the Western systems, to follow Britain and France in acquiring their own atomic weaponry capability. I mean, in a sense, partly that was seen as probably too provocative to the communist powers, but also it represented what the Americans felt would be a dangerous transfer of West German and Japanese military resources. So, number one, very important in terms of strengthening Western structures, in terms of developing the interoperability of them, which was very difficult because whereas in World War II, the interoperability had essentially been the Americans, the Canadians, and the British. By 1955, interoperability includes Belgians, Dutch, Norwegians, West Germans, and for that matter, a whole host of allies across South Asia as part of the Cento and Cito systems. So that's not easy. Eisenhower was good at that. He was very good at understanding that defense fundamentally involves diplomacy, fundamentally involves keeping an alliance mutually cooperative, mutually aligned. And in doing so, for example, one of the major tools he used, it had been used under Truman, but it was very much developed under Eisenhower, was the transfer of American surplus equipment to allies, for example, a lot of warships to Latin American allies, and training them in using them, and as it were, expanding the network of the American soft power. Now, you might argue that giving somebody quite a few tanks or aircraft, and lots of American surplus tanks were distributed, you might argue, and that's not quite what you mean by soft power, but it is in fact a form of soft power. The number of states that were armed with American armaments and whose officer corps were trained by the Americans was higher under Eisenhower than ever prior to that. I mean, obviously it continued after that, but it was higher under Eisenhower than ever before. And that was very significant for American strategy and the American clout. There were also, of course, other aspects of this. Other aspects include intelligence operations, degree of subversion of states regarded as hostile and governments regarded as hostile. That, of course, was as part and parcel of a general pattern of Cold War operations in which both sides were, as it were, doing that. But Eisenhower, in particular, alongside his trying to keep the Western alliance system as robust as possible, partly because that was his learning, his pattern of belief, I think an understandable one, a sensible one, in the aftermath of the years prior to World War II, in which both Germany and Japan and developed their strength. There was also his concern to indicate opposition to what was known as rollback. Now, other terms were used as well, but the idea was that in trying to destabilize the Soviet Union, there might be the risk of war. There were particular controversies, obviously most specifically over Hungary in 56, but also actually over East Germany in 53. There were sort of violently suppressed protests in East Berlin, a number of other cities in 53, and in 56, Hungary itself, a state that had only as it were, precariously became communist. Most Hungarians had no wish to be communist. The Hungarian Rising was suppressed, and there was no NATO armed response. Now, you could argue with some cause that it would have been difficult to organize a NATO joint activity when the British and the French were jointly involved in trying to overthrow the left-wing nationalist Arab government of Nasser in the Suez crisis of 56. And that is true. There's no two ways about that. It was not the best moment to oppose the Soviet Union, which is one of the reasons the Soviet Union felt able to act relatively freely in 56. But again, what Eisenhower was trying to do was to establish criteria in which there was a limit to what could be done in terms of intervening in, as it were, the other sphere of influence. And that's to be taken forward, of course, by the absence of an armed response to the construction of the Berlin Wall in the early 1960s and so on. And in many senses, the Kennedy government, although a different politics to the Eisenhower government, continues the Eisenhower approach in Europe, whilst on the other hand, being different in Southeast Asia, because Eisenhower in 1954 had refused French requests to send forces to help the French in the Vietnam struggle. The Eisenhower administration was providing a lot of the French money, a lot of the liquidity. France, like other Western European states, was really bust at that stage. But Eisenhower, whilst being willing to provide the money, wasn't willing to provide the troops. I think it's fair to say that Kennedy, who had a more aggressive anti-communist policy, particularly, I think it's fair to say, one that was linked to the a kind of Catholic universalism. It's no accident that the Dien regime in South Vietnam was a Catholic one, that Kennedy was very close to the Cardinal Archbishop of Boston, very much to that stage of Cold War Catholic anti-communism. Eisenhower's anti-communism was much cooler in tone and content. And I think that's interesting. Now, subsequently, of course, that was to be presented as a failure. It was to be argued that Eisenhower in 56 compounded the Yalta and Potsdam failures of Roosevelt and Truman in allowing the Soviet Union to both establish and consolidate itself in Eastern Europe. And this appeared an unattractive account from the perspective of commentators in the late 80s, looking at the stance of Ronald Reagan. And then, of course, was to appear even more remiss when Soviet communism was to be shown to be very weak, was to collapse. And the argument was surely it could have been driven to collapse earlier, and that a lack of sufficient strength was a significant factor, lack of sufficient robustness. I think that's a rather mistaken view of the actual capabilities that existed on the ground and in terms of political resolve in the 1950s, and also a view that pays too little attention to the risk scenario of the 50s. I think that's quite significant. And furthermore, it's worth bearing in mind that the Russian, sorry, I should say Soviet military and the Soviet communist elite had in their eyes expended very large resources, very significant amounts of manpower to gaining control of Eastern Europe. In Budapest, there had been fierce fighting in the last months of the war. There was, with reason, a large Soviet war memorial thrown up there to the Soviet troops that had died. The idea of just accepting that they weren't going to remain dominant there was not a wise one. And indeed, one can turn it on its head and point out that the rapprochement of the mid-50s had enabled the end of the Soviet occupation of the Soviet section of the partition of Austria. Both the eastern section of Austria, the Soviets had partitioned, and their zone in Berlin. And that had been a pullback of the Soviet Union, acquired at the cost of the neutralization of Austria, and that in a way that offered a model that was possibly prudent, given the other range of American potential international commitments. And indeed, one could point out that one of the difficulties for any state, and particularly for a global power like the United States, is to prioritize between the differing fronts and commitments. That the United States in the mid and late 1950s had very heavy expenditure in maintaining and developing its air force, in developing a missile capability, in being strong in naval terms, in trying to replace increasingly weak and failing European colonial powers in the so-called Third World. It faced the need to have a large force to provide the security of South Korea, a significant force in Germany, West Germany, so on and so forth. And in that context, to take on a new commitment, whether intervening in Hungary or indeed sending troops into Cuba to help Batista against Fidel Castro in 58, 59, was imprudent. I mean, it's interesting that Dulles questioned about this, and the Americans did send some tanks to the Batista regime, as indeed did the British. But Dulles said, tanks and heavy artillery can only achieve so much, and he made it clear it wasn't very much in the context of Cuba, and he was probably prudent and right to do so. Again, you could debate that. You could say a forward commitment of forces might have acted as a greater deterrence, or you could say the Americans had a track record of sending forces into places in the Caribbean and Central American position. They'd done that in the interwar period, as I've already mentioned, in Haiti and Nicaragua. It hadn't worked terribly well. Ditto the commitment to the Dominican Republic. So caution might well be regarded as prudent, and what subsequently happened in Vietnam with the American commitment in the 1960s suggests that the commitment, restraining the commitment in the 1950s was also sensible. Let's lastly look, before we sort of take some questions and observations, let's lastly look at the Cold War at home. Now, one of the ways in which the standard, and British historians are exactly the same, there is a tendency to keep foreign policy and domestic policy at differences. And that's understandable, but of course the people that, as it were, direct government at the very highest of levels, and in the case of America, it's the president, aren't, as it were, separately taking nothing from one to the other. And of course, there was a rhetoric as well as a more quiet discussion in the United States about the possibility of the Cold War spreading to the United States. This was given novelistic form in what you would not probably see as much of a source for the Eisenhower years, more of a source for the Kennedy years, because of course he knew Kennedy, and Kennedy had him to stay in the White House, and that was Ian Fleming's James Bond novels. In the second of those novels, Live and Let Die, which came out in 1954, Bond is sent to the United States. And the reason he's being sent is that there is a Soviet network, he is told, in his briefing in London at the beginning, Soviet network being run in the United States. And this is a network which is using organized African American activism to, as it were, sort of challenge the stability of the American state. Now, you may well regard that as fanciful. I certainly regard it as fanciful. But as with most fanciful ideas, it's interesting to think about where it came from. Fleming, of course, from a number of visits to the United States, was a friend of J. Edgar Hoover's. Used to meet him whenever he went, and he went regularly. And this was the Hoover thesis. Essentially, Hoover, who, shall we say, was not short of a paranoia or two, Hoover had this idea that America was threatened by decolonization struggles, that this decolonization struggle would begin in the South, that the brutalization of African Americans by the white supremacists in the South could well become a process that was actively resisted, and that this would provide an opportunity for the Soviet Union to exploit difficulties in the American backyard, front yard, one should possibly say. And there was that degree to which process and push for desegregation from what one has to say were fairly conservative individuals, and there were a degree to which both Hoover and Eisenhower as president, and for that matter, Truman with the desegregation of the military, they were in a sense doing that partly because of a kind of Big Tent approach to American identity. And of course, Republicans at that stage, before the Republican Party moved far to the right, as it subsequently was to do, but Republicans had no love for Southern white supremacists. And so in some respects, this was the party of Lincoln under Eisenhower saying, right, These people are threatening now because this could be exploited. The kind of left-wing possibilities that you've seen in the British or French empires, you might see in Alabama next if you don't stop mistreating these people. So that element is an interesting aspect, and one can therefore think about things like the deployment of airborne forces to Arkansas as part of the Cold War configuration of American politics. And of course, it was linked to the idea that security at home could not be automatically taken for granted. Now, that narrative had come from all sorts of places. Part of that narrative, of course, you can see in the kind of sort of the hysteria associated around the argument about massive communist penetration of the State Department, Hollywood, and everything else. So there's that element of it. There's the element, of course, in terms of trying to make America a more defensible polity, which is a reason, not the only reason, of course, but it's a reason for the development of the interstate system, the ability to move military units and military supplies more readily across the United States and to deal with the possibility of threat. And of course, this does not seem too remarkable once you remember that there were, as it were, the equivalent of the colour code plans of the interwar years. There were those equivalents which was saying, if Western Europe falls to the Soviets, and if the Chinese, become more of a threat, then we have got a recurrence of the challenge that we had from the Germans and the Japanese at the early stages of World War II. In other words, the notion of hemispheric defense. Incidentally, among the American military planning in the 1950s, was planning, and was including active surveying of the British coastline. I mean, the British government knew about this, of the British coastlines, as to if, in the event of the Soviets conquering Western Europe, including Britain, where on the west coast of Britain should American troops land as part of a sort of 1944 all over again D-Day. Where was identified, in fact, was the Pembrokeshire coast around Milford Haven. But what you've got is to bear in mind that there are a whole series of manifestations to defense and geopolitics which interact in the most broad and wide range, other than those that one tends to think about. So I want to close on this point about the domestic scenario, because I think that alongside, as we said at the beginning, this sense of the 1950s as a golden era of high prosperity for the majority of Americans, of the stability of 8 years of the same government, following on a period, the Truman administration was not wildly different, though there were differences of emphasis, but not wildly different to that of Eisenhower, alongside a sense of growing public capital, investment in schools, interstate highways and whatever. Nevertheless, there were anxieties aplenty. There was a sense about a need for vigilance. And there was also no confidence that the world was necessarily getting better. Indeed, from the American perspective, the initial enthusiasm, the idea, rather naive idea of Roosevelt's, that the fall of the Western European empires would make most of the world free and accessible for American democracy, capitalism, and values, had been replaced by the mid-1950s by a sense of growing anxiety that the fall of these empires was going to lead to a more challenging and menacing world in which increasingly authoritarian and anti-American states would develop, that these would look to the Soviet Union. And at that stage, people didn't realize the growing tensions between Mao and post-Stalin Soviet Union, and that America was therefore facing a more difficult world. And in that context, I think it's important to note the significance of Eisenhower's, in my view, wise custody of American interests in that period. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Jeremy. That was a great presentation. I have a lot of questions, maybe some that don't actually go with our theme, just questions of interest. But I will look at the questions in the chat first. For those of you who are in person here at the library, there are pads on your table. You can write out your questions and give them to William. And he will type your questions in the chat as well, so we can make sure that we get those.
Whilst you're just doing that, can I just pop to the restroom for a second?
Sure.
Thank you.
I can fill some time. Sure.
Thank you. I'll be back in a second.
All right. So for those of you who are online, if you just want to, whether you're on Facebook or on YouTube, you can type your question in the chat. I will moderate your questions as best I can, and we will ask for a little while. We are getting close to our normal cutoff time, but we will get as many questions in as we can. In the meantime, we'll go ahead and let you know about our upcoming programs. But first, we want to say thank you for joining us. Our 2023 public programs are made possible by the Eisenhower Foundation and the Jeffcoat Memorial Foundation, and we want to always say thank you for their generous support. And our next program, we're going to dig a little bit more into the Cold War and look at agricultural economics during the Cold War. I think that is something that is near and dear to people here in Kansas. And so we will welcome Dr. Jennifer Ist from Kansas State University, who will talk to us in person about agricultural economics, but we will be broadcasting this one as virtually. And then in April, we will welcome Scott Finley, who is working on his PhD, and he will be talking to us about the Suez Canal. All right, as we're waiting for Dr. Black to join us again, I am looking for questions in the chat. And I am hoping that you have some questions, but if not, I have some, as always. And I do want to thank you all again for your patience with us with our technical difficulties that we have had today. But we are back on board, and hopefully we will, this broadcast has been good for you, and we will be fine from here on out. What you are seeing on the screen is the opportunity to do research at the Eisenhower Library. That is what we do. We make access happen here. We are the keepers of the records of President Eisenhower, his administration, and his personal papers as well. So you can go to our website, eisenhowerlibrary.gov, and you will find research tools. You will find documents that have been scanned already, and you can start your research there. But if you find that there's some more information that you need to know and that it is not on the website, you feel free to reach out to our archives department, and they will be happy to help you. And he's back, so.
Thank you. Sorry.
No problem. Thank you so much. We will start with the questions in the chat. First, it says, you mentioned the paranoia on both sides in the early 50s. Do we have any sense now, with the passing of time and scholarly research in archives, what the reality was? And I think this part goes with it. What were the Soviets and Americans really prepared to do?
Well, that's an excellent question. Can you thank the questioner? I think it's fair to say that what they were really prepared to do is both sides were prepared to use nuclear weapons. The question would be, for both of them as to what the trigger stage would be. In other words, a crucial element for Eisenhower and for NATO planning was the sense that if the Soviets attacked, given their overwhelming conventional superiority, would the West, by which we mean America, go for the use of nuclear weapons first? And under Eisenhower, NATO strategy moved strongly in that direction, because the fear was that otherwise there would be a very rapid collapse of the Western system. And from the American point of view, the Americans did not want to be in the state they had been in the summer of 1940. In the summer of 1940, with France knocked out of the war, the Germans in control of Norway, Denmark, Holland, and Belgium as well, and it appeared imminently as though Britain was going to fall. The Americans were I think the euphemism would be deeply troubled. I mean, you can forget all this isolationist rubbish, which people come out with. As far as American policymakers were concerned, they didn't want to have to fight alone. They didn't want the German Navy pursue. And remember, Germany was then allied to Japan, Italy, and the Soviet Union, and had good relations with Spain. They didn't want the German Navy developing bases in places like the Canaries and the Azores and so on. So the fear for American policymakers in the early 50s is we're going to get there again, that the Soviets, who now are allied also with China, are going to take over, they're going to take over Western Europe quite easily. They're going to be able to intimidate, unless we're there to stop it, Japan and South Korea. We're in a difficult situation. Was that paranoid? Well, I think it's fair to say that you'd have to be a very risky person to bet on Stalin. Stalin did at times pull back. He pulled back from his commitment in Iran, into which, he'd sent troops, but he pulled back from that commitment. But I think it's fair to say that it's understandable to see American concerns. Equally, as you're aware, the Soviets had this view that the Americans were encircling them, and they looked with alarm at American defense systems in Western Europe, the extension of NATO to include Greece and Turkey, the extension of Western alliance systems to include Iraq, which until 1958 was a Western ally, Iran, Pakistan, and so on. So the Soviets were troubled as well, and the Soviets had this idea that the way to deal with this was to jump over those systems and acquire allies beyond, like Egypt, which of course that in turn fed through into Western concerns and anxieties.
Okay, thank you so much for that. If you're okay, we're a little past our time. If it's okay with you, we'll ask a few more questions. But for those of you who can't stay with us, thank you again for joining us. But for those of you who can, we will try to continue to answer these questions as long as Dr. Black is available. Okay, let's see. You spoke about the development of regional alliances and building diplomatic interoperability in containing communist influence. Although history isn't linear, do you believe that similar strategies are effective in addressing the current situation in Ukraine, or do you see different approaches as necessary?
Oh, wow. Well, the Ukraine crisis. In fact, I've got a podcast coming out on that tomorrow. I think what I would say is in Ukraine, we've had a double failure. We've had the Russian failure to understand the nature of public opinion in Ukraine, the resilience of Ukrainian civil society and its willingness to fight. And Russian planning last year was maladroit and execution was worse. So whatever they do this year, they have taken enormous costs to their system. We also had bad situation in the sense that both American and British intelligence gave very open public warnings about Russian preparations, and yet deterrence failed. Now, you can discuss whose fault that was. I think it's obviously a shared fault, which includes, France, Germany, America, Britain. All of us, didn't do it adequately. But the result has been to make it unclear how best to employ deterrence if one is looking at scenarios such as the protection of Taiwan or the protection of NATO's Eastern European partners, or for that matter, the protection of neighbors in the event of Iran weaponizing its nuclear weaponry, potential nuclear weaponry. So I think it's fair to say that there are a lot of lessons from the 1950s that can be drawn. But one of the interesting ones that is the case and that is worth thinking about is that however much there may be differences of opinion within states, whether we're thinking of France or Britain or the United States, it's very important to realize that that if you criticize a government, whether you like it or not, if you criticize it, you are actually giving support and encouragement to foreign authoritarians. I don't think it's any secret that in diplomatic circles, strategic circles, it was widely believed that President Putin was hoping for a different result in the American midterms and was thinking that that would be something that would be encouraging to him. I'm sure that isn't a surprise to American listeners. If it is, they're stupid. Because obviously people in states look at elections in other states and think, what does this mean in terms of international relations? So if America wishes to play as the key role it does, it needs, as its allies need to do, to show a degree of consistency between governments. Absolutely fine to change government, not a brilliant idea to signal to everybody that if you change your government, you might change all your policies, because all that does is means that allies and other powers think they can't rely on you. And one of the strengths of the American system in the late 40s, 50s was a general confidence that there would be a high level of consistency, even if there was a change of government, as there was in both 1952 to 53 and then again in 1960 to 61. So one needs to think about that level of engagement if one is looking forward. And so do other states. Exactly the same point can be made for Britain, France, Japan, anybody else for that matter.
Okay, we're going to skip down because I think you answered the next question. What was the relative size of the Soviet and U.S. economies during the 1950s and 60s?
Oh, the American economy was much, much bigger, but American economy was supporting a much higher standard of living. So that in essence, the Soviet economy was squeezing its standard of living. Hilariously, it claimed to be a workers' paradise. The last thing it was a workers' paradise. It was a paradise for bureaucrats and tank manufacturers. And so that in essence, the Soviet, there are all sorts of disagreements as to what Soviet productivity was, because everybody believes quite rightly that the Soviets lied. But you'd almost certainly be having at least a quarter of Soviet GNP going on defense. A really significantly high percentage. And of course, that remains the case today. If you look at a slave society like North Korea, it has a formidable military, partly because it can force its citizenry to accept extraordinarily low standards of living, whilst resources are concentrated on the political rulers and on the military.
All right. Our last question in the comments, and then I have two questions. Why did CETO fail?
Sorry, why did?
CETO? I think it's CETO,
CETO failed. Oh,
SEATO,
yeah,
the
why would CETO
Southeastern
fail?
Treaty
Well,
Organization.
I think CETO failed essentially because of the Iraq Rising of 1958. And Iraq, in many senses, was the key military asset because the big Iraqi air bases, which had been developed when it was under British control, round Kirkuk and Mosul, were what was designed to bomb southern Russia from. From there, the plans were to bomb the Donbass, the iron and steel works there, and to bomb the oil facilities in Baku, in Azerbaijan. So you've got that as a real problem, and Iraq becomes, a Ba'athist left-wing regime, as does, of course, Syria under Assad Senior eventually, Iraq eventually under Saddam Hussein, and then you've got, as it were, actively hostile, actively anti-Western, strongly anti-American states in the region, and that's a real problem. A real problem indeed. And, I think it's fair to say that these changes of government, and the same thing with the fall of the Shah later in Iran, what you ended up with was a really hostile anti-Western government, which caused regional instability that was an enormous problem, has remained an enormous problem in the case of Iran.
Okay, now to my two questions. The first one is a little background about me is that I'm an educator. I used to be a teacher. And one of the things that we study in education is the change in public education in America in the 1950s. What you have is, Americans are prospering more. And so for the first time in American history, the majority of teenagers are actually going to high school and getting high school diplomas. But this is also these teenagers are now have more income, and so they're getting more independent. And this is also the time where rock and roll hits the scene. And my understanding of it is this also happens in Great Britain as well. This sort of change in education, but overall, there's a fear from American adults that this new generation of kids they're wild and they're losing their minds, and there's this society is failing. And you talk about this Cold War fear and all of that, and I'm wondering if those things are tied together, if this fear of what's happening to American teenagers, which now we see is just normal teenage stuff, is sort of fueled by what is happening in the world.
Yeah, I think that's a brilliant question. And actually, interestingly enough, and I know it's fiction, but he based it on his conversations with Hoover. If you look at Live and Let Die, the idea is that America is being infiltrated. The communists are using drugs to try and seduce the young. And there is this sense of, narcotic drugs to try and seduce the young, which of course is an anxiety that goes right the way back to the previous anxieties about opium and Orientals, which had been a standard theme in a lot of anti-Oriental literature, but also anti-Oriental, anti-immigrant, know-nothing politics in both the United States and Britain. So I think moral panics are very strong, but what's interesting about moral panics is that the moral panic of the 50s was located in the Cold War. You see, a classic instance of that is the religious dimension of it. The standard phrase used when people talked about communism in the United States was they said it was atheist and atheistical, which is true, it was. And the idea, in other words, was the young, if they are going to be increasingly secular, they are going to be more attracted by communism, and communism is going to work through well, actually, the communists weren't that organized, and it wasn't, it was a much more complex relationship as to what was taking place. But yes, the moral panic, the moral anxiety was very much one located in Cold War terms.
All right. And my final question, I think the final question for today, you mentioned the difference between how Eisenhower and Kennedy approached the Cold War. And I think you referred to President Eisenhower's approach as very cool. And one of the things that we talk about here is how Ike the soldier, General Eisenhower's experiences influenced his presidency. Do you think that Ike, the General Eisenhower, Ike the soldier, who wasn't a fan of war, that really influenced and impacted how he approached the Cold War?
Yes, I mean, I think he was a very mature individual, very thoughtful individual. He also, and I would say this is a significant difference. I'm not here to run down Kennedy, but this was a significant difference to Kennedy. Kennedy's background was that of adversarial democratic politics. By democratic, I don't mean the Democratic Party, I mean the rivalry between the two political parties in Congress. Eisenhower's background was a more inclusive, non-politically partisan background. And I think that gave him a different feel to power, politics, and government. And I think actually it made him the president of all that, to my mind, is most similar to George Washington. And I think that is important. I think Washington was a very impressive president with a very strong sense of public duty, and very different, of course, to the highly politicized rivalry that followed him, particularly in the 1800 presidential election, which nearly led to fighting. And I think that there is something about a certain mindset that is important. And if I might make a last comment on this, when America, there are strengths and weaknesses of all governmental systems. The British have weaknesses in plenty. But when the Americans elect a president, they're electing somebody who is both an aspiration, a head of state, and a CEO, a head of the government. The task is very difficult. Each of the tasks is difficult. It's very difficult to bring one individual in line to do both. The unusual thing about both Washington and Eisenhower is they were good at both tasks. And it's not a criticism of other presidents to say that proved very difficult for many presidents, often because of context, often because of the political rivalry of the period. But I think there was something particularly impressive. I mean, to me, I'm a non-national. My daughter lives in America. My father's three sisters all married Americans, but I'm a non-national. So if a foreigner may be allowed a comment without in any way saying anything in particular, I would say I think the Americans made the right choice in the 1952 and 56 presidential elections. And I think they had a good person to choose, and they chose them. And that, of course, is the ultimate proof of the pudding of democracy. Now, lastly, were any of my listeners to like that and you to want me to invite me back, I could give you a brilliant talk on James Bond in America, which might be of interest, because I am the author of 2 books on James Bond.
We might take you up on that. I'm a fan of Bond. And we also agree with you that the American people got it right in the 1950s. And we know here that Eisenhower was a fan of Washington. So thank you for those comments. There was a few questions in the chat about your podcast, so we will be sharing that. So for those of you who are interested in hearing his podcast, we have it on the screen. Podcasts and lectures, fashioning the national in the 18th century.
Oh, well, okay, I do lots of them. You've just got to look up the Critic website. The Critic is a British magazine, and they have a website. And what I'll do is I'll send you tomorrow a link to some more of them. But if you look up The Critic, there's lots of them. And there's one going up tomorrow on Ukraine. I know that because I recorded.
Okay, if you send that link out, we'll be happy to share it. And so I want to say thank you again for joining us. I've been told there's a loud applause from the audience in person. So want to make sure you see those kudos, and I won't hold you much longer. I want to say thank you to everyone again for joining us, and have a great afternoon.
Thank you very much.